Hi, everybody. This is the What It Means podcast, and welcome. The title for this version is From Ground Leases and Walk-Ups to the Blizzard of Oz. So we have lots of stuff to cover. For those of you that don't know me, Jonathan Miller, I am the author of the Douglas Elliman Market Report series. I've been doing that for over 30 years. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Miller Samuel Real Estate Appraisers, and we cover the New York City metro area and the Hamptons and the North Shore of Long Island. We also I teach market analysis at Columbia in their grad program, Masters of Real Estate Development. And I am the author of Housing Notes, housingnotes.com, which is free. And if I get annoying, it's easy to unsubscribe, one click. But it'll give you it's sort of covering the topics of the day or what people are talking about during the week to sort of help you parse it out, especially when you're interacting with your clients or customers in real estate. The first thing I wanted to cover, and actually I'll just tell you what my goal here is. I want to cover uh, walk-ins or the concept of uptime in real estate brokerage offices. I want to cover the topic of ground leases. I want to talk a little bit about the appraisal world and then sort of what's up with all the national numbers on housing. Things are going up, things are going down, and sort of talk a little sense into it. But let's start with the sort of walk-in concept. For those of you that know me, I was a real estate agent for about 6 months before I moved to New York City. I was in a suburban Chicago, and the company I work for, Century 21, I had one of those gold polyester jackets. This is back in the 80s. And I had left my job as a hospital administrator in downtown Chicago. There were bullets being fired in the alley outside my office. I had about a dozen employees in my department, and two of them had children murdered in about 13 months I was there. So it was really like an intense place, and I didn't have a lot of passion for it. So I got my real estate license, and I took night classes, got my real estate license, and then I applied for a job or a broker position as a newbie for a Century 21 office in a small suburban town in west of Chicago. It was a town called Lombard, if those of you are familiar with Chicago. And it was on the main street. It was a big old house that had been converted to an office. And uh, on the walk-in concept, which doesn't seem to be a thing coming out of the pandemic anymore. Maybe I'm wrong, but essentially they had a schedule, and there was somebody that had the primary uptime, and then there was a backup uptime, and I was a backup on my first day, and that meant that any phone calls coming in looking, for with customers looking for houses or walk-ins, and there were a fair amount of walk-ins at this office, that the uptime person would get first position, would get first dibs on that incoming those contacts, sort of sales leads, and I was the backup. And I remember the guy that was the first person that was in front of me in uptime. I had met him a couple of weeks before when I went looking to work for, real estate companies. And I remember walking into the office, and he had a half-eaten donut in his hand. He was holding a lit cigarette with a lot of ash on it in the same hand. And then he was holding a paper cup of coffee in the other hand. It was just like the stereotype that you can imagine. And couldn't be nicer. Um, but I thought, wow, I'm really in for a change, because I'd come from an industry where I was working 90 hours a week, and it was pretty intense. And then all of a sudden, I'm in this real estate office, and the uptimes, I want to say it was like a 2 hour window. I don't remember. It might have been three. And there was an upstairs, and this guy, I think his name was Jeff, that had first position, um, looked down the stairs and he could see the guy coming in, and the next customer, and he looked disheveled. His hair was really disheveled, and he had like a grease stain on his shirt. And my this Jeff said, "You know what? I've got 5 minutes. I've only got 5 minutes left. Why don't you take him, and I'm going to go get a bite to eat." And I sold him a house. It was the biggest house of the month, or whatever, highest priced house of that month, which wasn't much. It was 92.5, and it had all kinds of hair on the deal and everything. But I sold, and it was the day that you know, I had gotten my lockbox and my license all came at the same time. So I was all ready to go. And I thought it was pretty interesting. And then, like, sometime later that week, I was his backup again on uptime, and he did the same thing. He went down to the local diner and got like a greasy French fries and a hot dog in a paper bag that the grease was coming through the side. And and I sold a house, from the lead that he gave me, because he had 5 minutes left. And then I proceeded to do that like three or four more times, um, to other people, until everybody got the idea that, Miller, if he's your backup, um, he's going to sell something. And I became the number two agent in the office, having a great time, but knew that I didn't want to, do this full time. I wanted to go into something more analytical, which is sort of how I fell into the appraisal sort of market analysis thing. But anyway, it was really interesting, and now there's not. It doesn't seem to be, at least the feedback I get after the pandemic, with people working more at home than in the office. It is less of a thing now, is what I'm being told by my broker friends. Anyway, enough of that. Um, the next thing I want to talk about were something a little less uh, light, and that was ground leases. And there was a great Wall Street Journal article about a building in Manhattan called Carnegie House, that was the 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 entity that owned the land that the building was sitting on. What happens in ground leases typically is, at least in New York, they tend to be co-ops tend to be on them, sitting on them. So the long-term view, which I don't think many people realize, is when you own the land under a co-op, the long-term objective after the ground lease expires or the co-op defaults on the ground lease payments, because the land gets reappraised every 30, 40 years. And so you can imagine, a 40-year difference in value of the land that gets translated into higher rent that the co-op has to pay. And so, uh, the objective, even though it's never talked about for most landowners on these properties, is to eventually, the building, if they default on the ground lease, they become effectively a rental building, and everybody loses their equity. And then they're eventually able to vacate the building and tear it down and build something new. And uh, I actually, in the past, I consulted. There's a building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan called Trump Plaza, and over 10 years ago, I have a LinkedIn explanation about this, and how it works in my housing notes, one of the articles I wrote last week. Um, and what happened in the case of Trump Plaza is, it's, say, a 900 square foot large one bedroom apartment already had a maintenance of about, I want to say, this is more hypothetical, 2,500 a month, which is on the high side. It should have been about 12 to 1,500 a month, but it was already high. And then when the ground lease reset, meaning that 40-year period where the land was reappraised, and then the rent is calculated usually 5 to 7% of what the value of the land is. That's the monthly payment or the annual payment. That 2,500 a month maintenance would go to 13,000 a month. And since the apartment would only rent, most optimistically in the say 5, 6, or even 7,000 range, even a cash investor would never buy that, because why would you buy something where the rent doesn't even cover the monthly maintenance? There's no real incentive, and so it becomes a disaster for the parties. What Trump Plaza ended up, the board was very sophisticated, very smart, and they ended up engineering a way where the unit owners would actually bought the land, not collectively as a co-op, but individually. So if my apartment was worth $1 million before the reset of the land value, um, I was trying to, by maybe investing $600,000, I would save 3 or 400,000 or 500,000 of my equity. Um, anyway, it's very convoluted to people that own condos or single families. But co-ops are, uh, there aren't a lot of co-ops with ground leases, but it generally doesn't happen in a fee simple single family or condo um, um, setup. But um, that's just my experience in New York. I know co-ops are dominate the New York City housing stock. Other places in the country that have a lot of co-ops are Baltimore, Washington. Watergate Hotel, the other side of it, was a co-op, or is a co-op in Washington. Berkeley, California is a hotbed of co-ops, and there's a bunch of co-ops in Berkeley, I'm sorry, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, of all places. They're all over the country, but in very small numbers. In Manhattan, they outnumber condos 3 to 1, and are by far the biggest form of residential housing stock outside of rentals in terms of owned ownership stock. Anyway, I bring that up um, because I wrote a post about this on Housing Notes. Like, why would you ever buy a ground lease? And I think the appeal for people buying co-op apartments in ground lease buildings is that they tend to be a lot less expensive. Even, the monthly maintenance is very high, but the lender that gives you a loan, you're buying an apartment for 600,000, studio for 700,000. It might cost $1 million in the open market, but in a ground lease co-op, it costs 6 or 700,000 or 500,000. And the reason for that is because the lender is now in third position in a co-op. The ground lease, the landowner is in first position to get paid if things go sour. The underlying mortgage of the co-op is in second position, and the individual um, mortgage on the apartment is in third position. So it's worse than a home equity loan in terms of, like, risk, in terms of getting paid back. However, the reality is that if you look at foreclosure rates in co-ops, they're dramatically less than condos, largely because co-op boards do a much better job of vetting the financials of the buyers than than uh, banks do. So anyway, interesting stuff. The third thing I wanted to talk about was sort of the state of the appraisal industry. And real quick, because it is a very niche, Miller Samuel, my company, we do appraisals for a living. This is our bread and butter. Um, we do appraisals that aren't just for purchase. If you're a real estate agent and you run into appraisers, that is what we do, but it's not the biggest part of what we do. It's maybe a third to a quarter of our business is appraising interest rate related real estate assignments like refinances and purchases. Um, the bulk of what my firm does is we do a ton of sort of litigation support or legal or tax or law sort of related, like we do a lot of estate appraisals, a lot of divorce or matrimonial work. We do a lot of gift tax, things like that. That's that sort of a bread and butter of our practice. Um, the reason why I'm going into all this is because managing agents in New York City, it's been our observation that they are now really gouging uh, appraisers inquiring about data. So I'll give you an example. Say I quoted a fee for a bank for an appraisal in Manhattan of just pick an even number, like $1,000. Typically, um, we also add to that um, that we know that the management fees are $100 to $200, and so that's information we're trying to get updates on the underlying mortgage and uh, how many units are um, owned and how many are rented, how many are stabilized rents, all that sort of mix, so that the underwriters at the bank, when they're reviewing the appraisal, can have that information to decide on the loan. And but now we're finding that the fees are like $600 for the data. Takes them managing agents 3 to 5 minutes, if at the most, to get that information. And they all started doing this, or not all, but a large number this year started to really jack up the rate. So if I'm quoting $1,000 for an appraisal, and then I find out this managing agent is charging $600, the banks are pushing back on that, understandably, because now it's $600 more, and then they have to go back to the borrower and all that's the applicant. And so I'm being asked to get paid $400 for my services that I quoted $1,000 indefinitely. And it's like my choices are to eat it or to not accept the assignment, which is really um, not not sustainable. We actually have to do work to make a living, to pay our office lease, to be able to pay our own mortgages, to get a salary, and we can't take a 60% cut um, because the managing agent is deciding, that that's what their service is now worth after 40 years of being predictable. I don't know what happened in the management world, but it's happening a lot. And it makes me feel like there was a meeting or something, within an association, and this was talked about. Or, when we had the inflation jump to 9% back a couple of years ago, and a lot of companies sort of jumped in and raised their prices. Maybe that's a remnant of that, but it's just bizarre, and it's alarming. So what we're doing is, luckily, because we do, a few thousand appraisals a year, is we have repetition, and we might go into the building a couple of times a year. We can use that data, or we just disclaim and say that the, the price is, or the cost of this is unmanageable, in the economics of an appraisal, and we are unable, but we've had, prior history, and this is what it is. And, um, the client is advised to get that information on their own. And so far that's worked. But, if you think about it, it's reducing the reliability of valuations that are used to assess the collateral of a loan, which is just not a good idea. Um, Speaking of collaterals of loans, one other appraisal issue that we run into, I don't know if you've read in the news, but Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government sponsors, sponsored entities that were taken into receivership a while back and are now sort of, operating under government control. The FHFA regulator run by Bill Pulte of the Pulte, I think he's the grandson or great grandson of the founder of Pulte Homes, was really hell bent on privatizing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac so that the taxpayer isn't on the hook. And last week that suddenly was reversed, and he said that we're not going to do that. Why should you care? Um, if they were to privatize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which basically in the New York metro area would be mortgages under $1 million. That's the conforming loan limit, roughly. Um, if that were to happen, mortgage rates, meaning if it was privatized, and the sort of on-off switch with privatizing versus stay in the government is that there's an implicit guarantee, meaning that if Fannie or Freddie, collapse, that the federal government would back them up, and that's worth about a 0.5%, maybe even a full percent. So if they were to privatize, in theory, um, with trillions of bonds that securitize mortgage, securitization of mortgages in the housing world, um, interest rates would probably pop a 0.5% to um, to even more, maybe a full percent, because there's no longer that implicit guarantee. So I suppose it's good that Fannie Mae um, and Freddie Mac, at least for the time being, are not going in to be privatized, because frankly, there wasn't a look into what it would do to the housing market and home prices and access to financing. Especially, I assume there would be a lot of sort of issues during the transition. So during this time of tariffs and significant economic uncertainty, I'm very appreciative that FHFA has paused or pulled back their intention to privatize Fannie and Freddie. I think that's good for the brokerage industry as well. Um, Higher rates at this point are not a good thing. Um, and, we're in a world that has, is creating an economic world that's creating upward pressure on interest rates. Anyway, I hope that was somewhat clear. The last thing I really want to talk about, and I went into great detail in my in housing notes uh, last week, was so right now we're getting a lot of conflicting signals about the direction of the market, and sort of inferences that we're all one big housing market, and a third of the home markets are seeing declining prices, and so that infers, it's all we're all joined at the hip with this. And an example of this is that existing home sales are falling, or staying, are well below long-term norms, but existing home prices, and this is like 90% of existing homes represent about 90% of the houses that sell. uh, Prices are rising, right? If you look at new home sales, the number of sales are rising, but the number of but prices are falling. So they're doing like the opposite. And then mortgage applications are up, but so are cash sales. And there are 50% more renters. I'm sorry, there are 100% more renters in the suburbs these days than there were 5 years ago. So there's just a lot of conflicting information about sort of macro trends in the country, and I really urge you to pay 95% of your attention to what's happening in local housing markets, and not what's happening in national housing markets, unless you're some sort of national lender and you just want to, see macro trends. But if you're a home buyer or a home seller, the local market is really 90%, 95% of what matters. The only thing that the national data does is influence sentiment or confidence, which is something I've talked about before. Sort of the difference between hard data, which is the actual numbers in the housing market, and soft data, which is sort of confidence and sort of more abstract, subjective things that are being tracked. And and so when you have this sort of national sort of take on numbers that are showing a lot of weakness, um, uh, that influences the soft data, sort of the confidence and the sentiment. So I'm not saying you should ignore it, but you should really pay a lot more attention to the local numbers. In my book, that's really all that matters. Anyway, that's enough for today. I wanted to thank you for spending your valuable time with me. I hope you got something out of it. I urge you to check out Housing Notes. A lot of this has been covered there. Housingnotes.com. It's quick to sign up, and it's free. And I encourage you to do that. But in the meantime, please remember always that pie is better than cake.